Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're putting on our historian hats to investigate one of the absolute most famous, haunting, and honestly misunderstood events of the 20th century. We're talking about the legendary final hours of the Titanic's musicians. We're going to look right past a century of tall tales to uncover the actual historical evidence. And trust me, the psychological science behind their fatal performance is just fascinating.
Music continued to play while the ship died. Man, that just gives you chills, doesn't it? I mean, we all know that iconic Hollywood image, right? The band standing valiantly on the slanted deck, playing the solemn hymn as the ocean just swallows the unsinkable ship whole. It's a gorgeous, tragic scene. But as historians, we really have to stop and ask how much of that actually happened. So today, we're relying strictly on survivor accounts, hard historical records, and modern emergency science to separate the cinematic myth from the incredible reality.
Here is exactly how we're going to break this down today. First, unlikely heroes. Second, the final song debate. Third, the psychology of panic. And finally, the shocking aftermath.
All right, let's dive right into Section 1, Unlikely Heroes.
So you know how the musicians have gone down in history as these fiercely loyal crew members who bravely went down with their ship. Well, here's a crazy historical fact. They weren't even official crew members. Not at all. These 8 men were actually independent contractors. They were hired through this Liverpool-based agency called CW&F and Black. Their one and only job was just to entertain the first-class passengers with some elegant dinner music. They weren't employed by the White Star Line, and they were under absolutely zero official orders to be out on that deck during the disaster. Let's take a quick look at who these guys actually were. The band was led by 33-year-old Wallace Hartley. He was a veteran of luxury liners, totally known for his calm, steady vibe. But then you also had guys like Roger Bricou, a phenomenally talented French cellist who was, get this, only 20 years old. These were just young artists out there doing their jobs. And the truly heartbreaking reality of it all, out of these 8 young men, not a single one survived. Let's trace exactly what happened on that freezing night of April 14, 1912. When the collision actually hit at 11:40 p.m., a lot of passengers didn't even flinch. It just felt like this long, dull vibration. But down below deck, the damage was instantly catastrophic. By midnight, officers were frantically preparing the lifeboats. And right here is where history is made. Without anyone telling him to, Wallace Hartley gathered his band and they just voluntarily started to play.
Okay, moving on to Section 2, the final song debate.
Navigating the primary sources from that night throws us right into one of the most hotly debated topics in all of Titanic history. What in the world did they actually play at the very end? The Hollywood myth, of course, insists it was the beautiful, solemn hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee. And sure, a few survivors swore that's exactly what they heard. But as we dig into the historical evidence and cross-reference other survivor testimonies, the needle points heavily toward lighter, upbeat tunes being played almost up to the final plunge. The prevailing theory among historians today? They were playing a popular, cheerful waltz called Song d'automne or Autumn Dream. Why? Well, think about it. Wallace Hartley specifically wanted to prevent a panic. A funeral hymn would have terrified people instantly, but a cheerful waltz, that creates a crucial sense of normalcy.
Now you might be asking yourself, how could witnesses possibly be so divided on a detail like a song? Well, as historians evaluating primary sources, we always have to look at the context. Imagine being there. It is pitch black. The freezing wind is absolutely howling. People are experiencing unimaginable psychological trauma, and survivors are floating away in lifeboats at totally different distances from the ship. Under those extreme, terrifying conditions, human memory fundamentally warps. Pinpointing an exact melody in that chaos is nearly impossible. But you know the one detail literally every survivor agreed on? The music never stopped.
Which brings us right to Section 3, the psychology of panic.
So the real story here isn't just what they played, it's why they played it. And this taps into the fascinating field of emergency psychology. We know that in mass disasters, human beings can react incredibly dangerously. Rational thought goes right out the window, and panicked crowds can literally crush each other to death. But medical and psychological studies have proven that controlled, rhythmic sound has this incredibly powerful calming effect on the human brain during a crisis. Those musicians, whether they studied it or just felt it intuitively, were actively applying advanced emergency psychology.
As several survivors pointed out, hearing a cheerful waltz echoing across a literally sinking ship, it created this bizarre illusion of safety. It basically tricked the panicked brain. Because the band looked calm and the music was upbeat, passengers subconsciously felt that, well, things couldn't be entirely hopeless yet, right? That illusion was absolutely crucial. It directly prevented deadly crowd crushes, rioting, and mass violence out there on a slanted, freezing deck where thousands were fighting for just a handful of lifeboat seats.
I really can't overstate the massive weight of their actions here. They were not just providing some poetic background music to a tragedy. By keeping thousands of terrified people emotionally anchored, those violins were buying precious, tangible minutes. They gave the ship's crew the order and the time they desperately needed to load and launch those lifeboats way more efficiently than if a full-scale riot had erupted. They were literally saving lives through sound.
Let's wrap things up with Section 4, the shocking aftermath. The way these musicians were treated right after the disaster is honestly a chilling piece of history. It sounds completely unbelievable, but families of some of the musicians reportedly received demands for payment related to damaged equipment and uniforms. Yeah, you heard that right. Because they were technically independent contractors and not official crew, they weren't even initially classified as heroes. Their grieving families actually got bills in the mail from their booking agency for the uniforms they lost while dying in the middle of the Atlantic. Thankfully, massive public outrage spread like wildfire and quickly corrected that injustice, elevating these guys to the legendary status they deserved.
As we talk about their legacy, we have to ground ourselves in the sheer, brutal physical reality of that night. -2 degrees Celsius, or about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That is how cold the water was. When that massive ship finally broke apart at 2:20 a.m., over 1,500 people were thrown into an ocean cold enough to kill a human being in mere minutes. The only reason the music finally faded out was because that freezing ocean finally silenced them.
But get this. From that freezing, dark abyss, a miracle artifact actually survived. For decades, everyone thought it was lost to history. But Wallace Hartley's violin, which actually had a beautiful, heartbreaking inscription from his fiancée on it, was recovered. It was fully authenticated, and over a century later, it sold at auction for £900,000. It's just wild to think about. A fragile instrument made of wood and string that played during humanity's most infamous maritime disaster somehow outlived the unsinkable ship itself.
In the weeks after the sinking, newspapers turned these 8 men into flawless, mythical beings. They became symbols of absolute perfection in the face of certain death. But you know what? The historical truth hit so much harder than the myth. They weren't superheroes. They were ordinary workers, young, terrified artists facing the exact same doom as everyone else on that ship. But in the absolute worst moment imaginable, they made a choice. They actively chose to comfort total strangers instead of scrambling to save themselves.
So we've completely stripped away the Hollywood myths, we've unpacked the emergency psychology, and we've faced the real historical reality of who these young men were. And it leaves us with one powerful thought. When the lights start to flicker, when the deck slants, and when civilization collapses into fear and darkness, what will you choose to leave behind? Thank you so much for exploring this with me today. I'll catch you in the next explainer.